Why is Newfoundland so different from the rest of Canada? It really is different. I mean, compared to other countries around the world, I know the resemblance is pretty strong. But considering this whole huge chunk of land at the top of the North American continent is one single nation, Newfoundland is a place that is pretty easy to distinguish, even amongst our confederated cousins. In my travels around Canada, I've found that every province has its own unique feel. Even regions within a single province can feel very different from one another. But even taking that into account, Newfoundland just stands out as being uniquely unique. Why is that? Now, this isn't a definitive answer to that question by any means, but I have 4 contributing factors to talk about here. 3 of these are pretty obvious to anyone who knows anything about Newfoundland at all, but they're still fun and interesting to talk about. The 4th factor isn't as obvious and isn't really as fun to think about, let alone talk about, but it's very important, and I'm actually going to spend a bit more time on this point than the others. It plays a big role in how Newfoundland society has developed over the centuries and how we have developed as Newfoundlanders right up to this present day. I'm going to start this discussion about Newfoundland by talking about Quebec. Well, come on, Quebec is another province that stands out as very unique. It's hard to argue against that. It seems easy to me to explain Quebec's uniqueness. It's a clearly distinct society within Canada, formed and fostered by France and the French language, growing into the one-of-a-kind cultural oasis that it is today. Now, I'm no expert on Quebec history, but the foundation of its differences seems obvious to me. The language spoken at home in Newfoundland and Labrador today is still overwhelmingly English, and it has been, for the most part anyway, since the first colonies were founded over 400 years ago. The Newfoundland culture that most of us recognize stems from British and Irish influence, but I'm willing to bet you already know very well what I'm talking about when I talk about the Newfoundland language and how that has shaped much of who we are as Newfoundlanders right up to today. It's more than an accent. It's more than uncommon words and expressions for common objects or ideas. Our language includes these things, but it's the tradition of how we share this version of English that really stands out. Storytelling and music, incorporating our own words delivered in our many different regional lilts, all working together to perform the act of communication. Some aspects of Newfoundland culture are just undeniable, obvious. We have our own way with words, and while I'm very aware and reminded in the comments of these videos often that mine is not a typical Newfoundland accent, the overall Newfoundland dialect is a marker of who we are. It helps us identify ourselves as Newfoundlanders. It's one of the first things a non-Newfoundlander will learn about us when they meet us that signifies our uniqueness. We are oddly proud of our weather. I don't think we're proud of it being simply, good or bad, and if you don't know, it's not good. But we're proud because it's an ever-present, pervasive part of our lives. It's never background noise. All decisions, every day of the year, must take weather into account. I'm sure there are plenty of other places around the world that know what I'm talking about, but I've lived in many different regions around Canada, and I've never experienced weather anywhere else like that on Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula. There are plenty of places in Canada that get colder than Newfoundland. In fact, the average daily low in winter in St. John's is surprisingly moderate compared with most major Canadian cities. But I bet many townies can tell you that even a couple of degrees above zero on a damp, blowy January night feels a lot colder than a windless -20 under the prairie sun. For me, it's the wind that separates Newfoundland from the rest of Canada. I know Portage in Maine and Winnipeg has a windy reputation, and I've experienced hurricane-force winds in other Canadian cities, but it's the relentless wind around much of Newfoundland where when you have a day of genuine calm, and these do not come along often, the silence in the air is haunting. It doesn't seem calm and peaceful. It's like something's missing. Newfoundland gets more than its fair share of snow, and some regions even more than others, right, Central? Newfoundland freezes up from late fall through early spring most years. Winter elements like these aren't what makes Newfoundland stand out in a country like Canada. For me, it is the relentlessly active weather, however that manifests itself season by season, that sets Newfoundland aside. Most of us live on an island. A good number of us live on islands off the main island. As for those of us who live in Labrador, which, if you're not familiar with the geography of Newfoundland and Labrador, is the mainland portion of the province, Labradorians live in pretty isolated communities, even the largest of the towns in the Big Land, in an isolated corner of mainland Canada's easternmost coast. Not only is it important to note that Newfoundland itself is an island, but it needs to be said that the center of Newfoundland commerce and politics has been situated on the farthest east corner of the island, away from the rest of North America. This was certainly more of a factor before Confederation, before roads were built, and before methods of long-distance communication were plentiful and affordable. Definitely less of a factor now with first telephones and TV, and now the internet. Like, the world is just smaller now, and everyone is influenced by similar sources. But it wasn't that long ago that there was no real way to drive from St. John's to Port aux Basques. Less than a generation before I was born, there was no major highway running across the island. One of the major reasons for the big Come Home year back in 1966 was to celebrate the recently opened cross-island paved highway, the Newfoundland leg of the Trans-Canada Highway. Basically, the Leafs haven't won a cup since the year after Newfoundlanders were first able to traverse the island. From some perspectives, that's a really long time. By others, it really isn't. Being on an island is isolating in its own way, but even within the island, the isolation was felt community by community for most of our history up until very recently. The entire world for many Newfoundlanders was very small indeed, up until very recently. Perspective is a powerful shaping force. What is possibly, for me, the biggest factor leading to Newfoundland's uniqueness is historical. I already basically said that I'm no expert in overall Canadian history, but I know at least as much as some about the founding of the Maritime provinces, Upper and Lower Canada, a bit about the road to Confederation, all that kind of stuff. I recently read a book about Canada's westward expansion called Promise of Eden. Canada expanded west with a plan, really a bunch of plans. The plans had some strong political support and real financial and business-minded incentives backing them up. It was by no means smooth sailing, but there was optimism and a drive to develop the lands of the Northwest. This is a fascinating contrast to the way Newfoundland developed over the 16th through 19th centuries, and even well into the 20th century, really. The earliest plans for Newfoundland involved less of a vision of development and more of a system of extraction. A small group of families from the West Country of England made fortunes from the industry in Newfoundland in the 15, 16, and 1700s, pulling all of the wealth from the great fishing station moored in the Atlantic away, investing nothing back into the place. Yet people came and clung to the shores to eke out a living. Laws were passed prohibiting settlers to build dwellings within 4 miles of Newfoundland's shore. People built anyway. There are documented cases of houses being pulled down, but people rebuilt. This went on for centuries. There is some dispute today as to how long settlement was actually considered illegal, and if there was ever even an actual codified law to this end, but there isn't much to dispute in the fact that settlement was at the very least discouraged. Yet people came, and they wanted to be here. For a very long time, rich people expected their workers to sail across the Atlantic, catch fish, split, clean, dry, and cure fish, and come back home to England at the end of the season. For their troubles, they would get enough food to not starve, and if they were lucky, a pat on the head. There were no wages for the most part. There was no R&D. That rock in the North Atlantic wasn't looked at as a land of opportunity. It was just a private money-making machine for people who already had more money than they knew what to do with. The migratory fishery was the sole source of interest in this place by those with the means to look deeper into what this place might offer, but the easy money, they didn't have to do any of the work, kept pouring in, so why mess with a good thing? Settlement was at the very least discouraged, if not outright outlawed, because they didn't want anyone cutting in on their racket. Yet people came, and more began to stay. As a year-long resident population continued to grow despite every discouragement, some dominant men decided to set up their own shop on the water streets of towns like St. John's and Harbour Grace. But the only difference now was that the hoarded wealth remained within Newfoundland's shores as opposed to being exported in full back to England. But it was still hoarded. No investment would be made into anything of real value, long-term or short-term, for the land or its people. St. John's is an old city, but the men who controlled the economy of the country fought successfully against incorporation and the formation of any kind of municipal government until 1888. Blocking any kind of democratic government wasn't out of concern for the best interest of the poor toilers of the land who generated their wealth. I wasn't there, but I can promise you that. Now, here today, there isn't a place in North America where rich people aren't shamelessly sucking up every penny they can from us. In Canada alone, Galen Weston can vote another race for himself while we all go into credit card debt to feed our families. This isn't a uniquely Newfoundland phenomenon. This stuff happens everywhere. It is and has been the way of the world. But Newfoundland has never known an instance in time where the merchants of old or the corporations of new found that it might make sense to invest a little something into the place. It's been 500 years of extraction and little else. This has an impact on the people and has kept a macro level confidence low. Things seem to have been changing in my lifetime, getting better. But when you tack on an ecological catastrophe on the scale of the total collapse of the North Atlantic cod stocks onto a long history of serfdom, it gets hard to breathe. But we move on. We were left for dead in the water in 1992, but we survived, and now we thrive. We were left for dead in 1933, when we, and big quotations here, willingly gave up our democracy, but we survived. We were sent up over the top on July 1st, 1916, literal cannon fodder. Many of our young men and boys did not survive, but as a people we did, and we grew stronger. And so the history goes, through fires, through financial collapse, through foreign attack, we survive. We find a way, and we move forward. In spite of all the opposition, in spite of the weather, the ridicule, the isolation, the oppression, we're still here. This is the nature of Newfoundland and the mark of a Newfoundlander. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this one, maybe you'll also enjoy this one over here. Hopefully I'll see you there. See you, loves you, bye.